Hi, guys, and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at ships of the pre-Federation Earth and Starfleet. So basically, we're going to be looking at vehicles from the Star Trek series prior to 2161, and specifically looking at ships from the show Star Trek Enterprise and First Contact. I'm not going to be touching on the DY 500 or the SS Valiant, simply because I don't think there's enough information out there to really cover here, because there's nothing definitive. I might actually do those in another video down the road for vehicles that we've seen in writing or mentioned, but that we've never actually seen on screen. So to start, we're going to cover real quick the Phoenix. This was Zefram Cochrane's warp test bed. Achieved warp 1, was the first vehicle to break the speed of light or circumvent the speed of light, however you look at it, and attract the attention of the Vulcans. There's some question about whether or not the Phoenix uses a matter-antimatter engine. I think Lily makes a comment in First Contact about how long it took her to scrounge up enough titanium to construct the cockpit of the Phoenix. I've always assumed that the Phoenix does not have matter-antimatter on board, but in fact is a fusion reactor that uses probably a deuterium-tritium reaction or just simply hydrogen. We know that a high-energy plasma is necessary to form a warp field, to pass over the warp coils. So this kind of fits. It's a much more low-powered version of what a matter-antimatter engine would produce. And I think it's more realistic to assume that he was able to develop a fusion reactor with the technology of the time and use that plasma channeled into the nacelles to create his first warp field. And I think a lot of ships following that use the same technology. Moving on from the Phoenix, we come to the Conestoga, which is the first ship we sort of see introduced definitively in the Star Trek universe that uses warp technology. It was launched in 2067, had an average warp velocity of around warp 1.3. It was traveling to a star less than 20 light years away from the dialogue on screen to colonize that planet. Archer makes a comment in Terra Nova that they designed the ship to be disassembled so they could build the colony out of it. It seems like 4 years is a pretty short amount of time to design and construct a colony ship. So I think that the Conestoga was more than likely a DY series vessel or in that general family of vehicles, and that warp technology was added after the fact, that maybe some of the components were swapped out to make room for warp engines. Going on, we have the SS Emmett here. This, I think, kind of fits more with something maybe that humanity constructed around the warp technology. Whereas we look at the Conestoga, it doesn't really... It looks very beautiful. I love the Conestoga, but I think that it was already a constructed vessel that warp drive was added onto or modified to support warp drive, whereas the Emmett, I feel like, was built from the ground up to be a warp shuttle. And most likely constructed on the moon, or maybe in orbit of the moon, or maybe in orbit of the Earth. It's referred to as a lunar shuttle, I think only because the only time we see it is when it flies over the moon in the opening credits of Enterprise. My guess would be 2080s, 2090s, probably the same warp velocity as the Conestoga, warp 1.3, somewhere in there. I don't see it traveling outside of the solar system very much. And that brings us on to the J-class, which is the first sort of cargo ship that we have in the lineage, because we know it's older than the Y-class. We see the Y-class first, but the J-class is actually older than the Y-class. Probably launched around the turn of the century, 2100, sometime in there. There is a throwaway line from Commander Tucker in Horizon that says that he heard a rumor that all of the warp casings were signed by Zefram Cochrane. And I think this is the first time we see a matter-antimatter engine in Earth's history at this point. I think that the warp engines was being designed by Zefram Cochrane, and that's where that rumor got started. We know it can achieve a cruise velocity of warp 1.5 and a maximum velocity of warp 2. My looking at the sort of the wings on those nacelles, I think those are after thoughts. I think those are components that are added. I'm sure the vehicle was upgraded over time to allow for a warp 2 velocity. Same with the Y class up in, to that point. Speaking of the Y class, launched. It's said in Fortunate Son it's a few decades old, or it's newer than the J class, I think. So probably 2120 somewhere in there. Warp velocity of 1.8. Matthew Ryan even says that in the episode in engineering. But probably can achieve warp 2, maybe 2.2, something like that. The nacelles are interesting on this. We do see them on the back end of it, along underneath the spine. From what we've seen, the front section with the crew cannot detach. We see the very large cargo pods that the Captain Keen, I think, and Ryan are throwing these the football back and forth in. Something to do with being able to access the cargo and being able to modify it. He even talks about the load is unbalanced, which causes some instability and things like that. That's probably things that were really discovered during the J class. We see the warp delta here. This is really going in line with the SS Emmett. I think that this is more of, whereas the J class we see in the Earth Cargo Service, the United Earth Space Probe Agency, I think that this is sort of their attempt to continue the SS Emmett design going forward. Maybe warp 1.8 somewhere in there. By the time we see it in Enterprise, maybe warp 2, 2.2, something like that. But during its heyday, when it was initially launched and constructed, I would assume warp 1.5, 1.8, somewhere in there. Probably 2130s, I would guess, just because of the designs of the Emmets and the cargo ships. The beginning of The Expanse, an episode of Star Trek Enterprise, where it's with the Intrepid. Now, the Intrepid is really interesting because I believe... I have always believed that the Intrepid was a test bed for the NX program. I think there's probably only maybe one or two of these in all of Starfleet. Yeah, it definitely has much larger nacelles and things like that. So I think that with the NX Alpha, which we see as being maybe a warp prototype, this is more of like a structural integrity. The Intrepid, anyway, is more of like a structural integrity vehicle designed to test the actual overall design, whereas the NX Alpha just has the warp engine inside of it with the nacelles. We also see the Sarajevo makes an appearance at one point. This is a really bizarre vehicle. I'm not actually a huge fan of it because I don't really know where it fits in. It kind of looks like the Arctic transport in a way. It has sort of that kind of design with it. So I definitely think it's a civilian vehicle. I think it's probably low warp velocities, maybe warp 2 somewhere in there. Constructed probably 2140s, well into the NX program. Near Earth flights and things like that. So it's probably been upgraded and things. But yeah, I don't really have a lot to say about this vehicle because I'm really not a fan. And then, of course, we have the NX class itself. When we look at the overall NX program, I think we look at the NX Alpha, the Intrepid, and then the NX class itself. And there's even a line in the beginning of Enterprise that they've achieved warp 4. So I think that, and they'll be going to warp 4.5. So I think we're really early in that. I think the Intrepid was probably maybe a few years before it, maybe 2048. Something like that, so that we have time for the NX Alpha and the NX Beta and even the NX Delta to achieve its mission, break the warp 2 barrier, warp 3, and that the Intrepid came on and had a cruise velocity of maybe warp 2.5, warp 3, and was probably the frontline ship up until that point. Those are the ships we've seen on scene on screen throughout all of Enterprise and in any movies that take place before 2161. I wanted to do a series that kind of broke down each of these ships, some of the more interesting ones, and really went into detail on a lot of them. Let me know what you guys think. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Always appreciate your guys' support. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. And let me know, which one of these ships do you want to see in more detail? I would love to be able to go through and talk about them all a little bit more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.